But no, directly to answer your question, that was not a standing order that churches be burned. And to my knowledge, there were none burned with people in them, as the movie The Patriot portrays.
Bill's got a great book back there. Other questions? Yes, sir.
On the subject of indigo dyeing, I wonder if Peggy Pickett would care to offer any information from her experience with indigo dyeing during her reenactment of Eliza Lucas Pinckney, or the other sort of a two-part question or comment. One aspect of, that didn't come out during last night's presentation about Rebecca Mott is the extent to which Peggy's research has found information that provides interesting differences from what have information that's been published by other authors in the past about some of the facets of the Rebecca Mott's and Jacob Mott during the time of the American Revolution.
As far as processing indigo leaves to make the dye, in the 18th century they did use dye of pre-adolescent boys was the preferred dye, so I understand. But today you can use chemicals. You can use, yeah, so if you ever want to try that, you don't have to worry about rounding up a lot of little boys. When I started to do research on Rebecca Mott, I've always been a little suspicious of the story that they stayed in Charleston for the siege. I don't think cities that are under siege are very good places for civilians to be. And civilians were killed during the siege of Charleston, and at the end, they were short of food. And they had a place to go, and I was wondering how I was going to find this out, how many papers I was going to have to look through, and if I would ever find out. But because Thomas Pinckney married Betsy Mott, and he wrote a lot of letters, and fortunately they're all digitalized and online, so they're easy to look at, I thought I would just try to see if I could find some clue in one of his letters. So I started in January 1780 and read every single one till I came to April 12th. And April 12th, Tom Pinckney was writing to his sister, Harriet Orring, at Hampton Plantation. Fairfield Plantation is very close to Hampton, and the Motts and the Pinckneys were good friends. So at the end of this letter, he says to his sister, I am enclosing a letter to Mr. Mott. I just received it, but, you know, obviously what he was saying is, I just got it, but it's been dated, you know, weeks ago. Please explain to Mr. Mott that I just got it. And so that to me says that if there's somebody in Charleston that wants to send a letter to Jacob Mott, why would he send it to Tom Pinckney on Sullivan's Island to send to his sister to give to Mr. Mott if the Motts are in Charleston? So I figured that they left at some time in the spring and took refuge at Fairfield.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yesterday, for the first time, I heard that a couple of prominent leaders of the revolution had written letters, I guess, saying that Gates should not be court-martialed for the Battle of Campfire, et cetera, et cetera. Can members of the panel comment a bit further on that? You know, the general one line that you read in a high school history textbook talks about Gates getting on a horse and riding as far and as fast as he can, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, we know about Gates's role with trying to replace Washington as commander-in-chief, et cetera. And, you know, Gates had kind of a up and down career in the American Revolution. Did some things that were maybe good and some things that were not so good. So there's quite a bit of mystery, I think, surrounding Horatio Gates.
Gates was, from what I've seen researched, he was a great administrative officer. great quartermaster. He really understood that. That's what he was doing in the British Army, came over. The fact that he was willing to serve in the American Revolution says a lot. Not everyone out there is a tactical officer. We've seen that in modern military and everything else. There's some folks who are better doing logistics, quartermaster planning, others are tactical. Eventually you run out of senior officer. You got to put somebody in charge, and yes, there's things going on. From what we've seen at the battle, he tried to stem the flow. But when you have an army in full rout, I mean, they are turning. It is very hard that even a commander and his staff can really do to stem the flow. Baron de Cobb is advancing forward. He's doing what he can with, basically he's buying time. He's doing his rear action. The militia's streaming through. You're going through the wagon trains, all of your supply lines, everyone's running through it. He's trying to organize, and the problem is he got caught up in that tidal wave. So it was very hard.
Kind of reminds you of George McClellan in the war between the states later on. Good analogy between Gates and McClellan. Both great organizers, trainers, and also administrators.
So I'd just like to add, when Washington was getting ready to go to the Second Continental Congress, he had two dinners at Mount Vernon that turned out to be very important. One was with Charles Lee, which it so happened Light Horse Harry, a 19-year-old, attended also. But Gates, Horatio Gates. So before he went to the Second Continental Congress in uniform, he had gone to the two most experienced ex-British officers in America to help him. So Charles Lee became third in command in the American Army, and Gates was the adjutant general. And if you read about when Washington went to Boston, they called it a rabble in arms. It was a mess, you know. Just spontaneously, New England had sent its soldiers to surround Boston. One of the stories was the colonel of a regiment had been the barber, so the colonel was shaving his men in the morning, which drove Washington nuts to see this total lack of discipline. Gates had a lot to do with getting the army organized and so forth. And I told you today that he took Monckton's orders back to the king with the announcement of victory at Guadalupe. So he was a respected military officer. At Saratoga, which is his great victory, he was blessed to have Daniel Morgan and Benedict Arnold, two of the finest fighting men in the history of that war. And they just took off. And if you see Gates at the decisions he made at Camden, it was kind of like, oh yeah. To give his everlasting credit, when he was given command of the Southern Army, which he did push Congress to get, he called Daniel Morgan out of retirement and brought him south. That led to the victory at Cowpens. He didn't get there soon enough for Camden. Morgan had quit because they had made Anthony Wayne the head of the Light Division, made him a general. Morgan got angry and went home. Gates got him to come back into the Army. I believe myself that if Morgan, for example, had been at Camden, Gates would have had a battlefield commander that he trusted, that he could say, okay, let's go do that. He didn't know DeKalb that well, he didn't know the others that well. And again, he was kind of a hands-off administrator. If he had a couple of fighting generals under him, I think he would have been all right.
One thing the Southern Campaigns presents with Georgia Carroll is there's as many experts in the audience as there are up here.
Well, thank you all for participating, and thanks the audience for participating. Lunch is ready to say a short prayer. Dear God, thank you for bringing this group together this morning. These people are working hard to preserve your country's history. Bless this food for the nourishment of our bodies. Amen. And let's start with Leon here leading the way.